Nicole Simmons learned the terrible news in the evening from a friend who came to visit her. It was obvious that her guest felt very anxious and couldn't muster up the courage to tell her something important. Unaware of what her friend had to tell her, Nicole smiled reassuringly and prepared to listen. "Do you know that David died?" Naomi asked cautiously. The question was followed by a brief moment of tense silence. "What do you mean, David died? What are you talking about?" Nicole asked in a trembling voice with tension. Her friend sighed sadly in response, but then lowered her eyes and continued. "David died in an accident a few days ago. Apparently, he lost control of his car and ended up in a ditch. The fuel tank got damaged on impact and the fire broke out. His body got burned badly. I thought that someone might have told you about it already. After all, they held the funeral just recently." But Nicole wasn't listening to her friend anymore. The woman's mind was pierced by a bright flash of pain, which caused a storm of emotions and tears. The thing was that her memory immediately turned into the unpleasant conversation she had with David, which, as it turned out, was the last one they would ever have. That day, they started fighting over something unimportant, but neither of them wanted to give in, so they parted ways, feeling angry with each other. Nicole suspected that it was David's parents who were to blame for it. They belonged to the city's elite. "Son, why do you even want to date that poor orphan? Trust me, she's not a good match for you," Dorothy Wilson kept repeating. At first, David didn't listen to his mother and did as he saw fit. But the more Mrs. Wilson insisted, the more he doubted his choice. David was unlikely to have broken up with Nicole, but as evil fate would have it, their next fight would be their last. All these thoughts flashed through the woman's mind in an instant, filling her heart with excruciating pain. At that moment, Naomi was already regretting having told her friend the devastating news. On the other hand, it was simply impossible to keep it a secret. Nicole spent the rest of the evening in tears, sorting through her pictures with David and thinking of their times together. Meanwhile, the woman was very upset that they didn't get a chance to attend David's funeral. Having mustered up her courage, Nicole decided to call Dorothy Wilson and find out what had really happened. No one picked up the phone for a long time, and when they finally did, Nicole heard the angry voice of David's mother. "How dare you call me, you vile beggar? My son died because of you. Do you hear me? You bring bad luck. Forget this number and don't you dare call me again." Unable to endure the accusations, Nicole hung up the phone and covered her eyes with her hands, crying softly. The woman was feeling miserable and couldn't understand why fate was being so cruel to her. The only bright ray in Nicole's hopeless life was David, whom she loved with all her heart. And now, Nicole had lost the only close person she had in her entire life. She felt worse with every passing minute. It seemed to Nicole that her life was over and there was no point in living anymore. The woman couldn't fall asleep at night, and therefore she felt simply awful the next morning. On top of that, the woman was feeling dizzy and nauseous, and it only got worse by noon. The rest of the day, Nicole tried to relieve the alarming symptoms, thinking that it must have been food poisoning. But when the next day her symptoms only intensified, the woman decided to see a doctor. After the initial exam and all the tests were done, Nicole was ready to hear a diagnosis, from food poisoning to acute appendicitis. But what the elderly doctor told her seemed simply incredible. "You're pregnant, young lady. It's still very early on, only about 3 weeks. Therefore, you should take better care of yourself and try to minimize stress and anxiety." "What do you mean, pregnant?" was all that Nicole managed to say. The doctor silently handed her a printout of the test results instead of a response, and the young woman understood everything without words. The news of her pregnancy shocked Nicole, but it also brought her to her senses like a cold shower. Now, the woman couldn't only think about herself and her misery, but also had to worry about her future child, whose father had died a week ago. Nicole didn't even consider terminating the pregnancy. The fact was that she grew up in an orphanage and knew nothing of her parents. Therefore, the young woman didn't think even for a second that getting rid of her own child was a viable option. The pregnancy was hard. Nicole felt bad during the entire 9 months. Morning sickness, dizziness, and general weakness accompanied her until the very labor. But when Nicole gave birth to her beautiful, rosy-cheeked daughter, her joy knew no bounds. All of her sorrows and anxieties immediately faded into the background, overshadowed by the happiness she felt over being a mother. Nicole named her daughter Sally after the protagonist of one of her favorite movies. Naomi supported her friend throughout this difficult period, helping her in any way she could. She babysat Sally, went to the grocery store, and even let her borrow some money, never expecting to get it back. Time seems to fly. 5 years passed, and each of them felt exactly like the one before. By that time, Sally grew up and wasn't causing her mother any troubles. Now that her daughter had started daycare, Nicole was thinking about getting a regular job. The fact was that Dorothy Wilson didn't give her own granddaughter a cent of what the baby was supposed to inherit in the event of her father's death. Why did you let it slide, honey? That's just wrong. Your daughter has the right to her inheritance. Get a DNA test if you have to, Naomi said, feeling very sick for her friend. You know, I really don't want to have anything to do with people who blame me for David's death, Nicole responded in a tone that wasn't open to objections. Despite how much time had passed, the woman still felt offended by Dorothy Wilson's accusations. On the other hand, Nicole was well aware that the older Sally got, the more money she would need. And therefore, hoping to find a suitable job as soon as possible, Nicole started the search. Unfortunately, it turned out to be much harder than the young mother had hoped. Ultimately, the only offer Nicole got was for a waitressing job in a roadside cafe, where most of the customers were bikers and truckers. Of course, there was no strict working schedule in the cafe, which didn't suit the young mother at all. And when Nicole had lost nearly all hope of finding a suitable position, help came from where she least expected it. One day, Naomi voiced a very interesting offer in a phone conversation with her friend. How do you feel about working as a maid for the Thompson family? Carl and Penelope are wealthy people and can afford to have help around the house. Sure, they're very old, but I don't think it would be a problem for you. Oh, and the best part is that you and Sally could live in their guest house. Nicole's eyes sparkled with joy. That would have been just wonderful. That's exactly the kind of job I was dreaming of. Naomi nodded in understanding and smiled at her friend, even though she couldn't really see it over the phone. The next day, Nicole and her little daughters were already standing at the gates of the Thompson mansion. It was a 2-story building with a red roof and ivy-covered walls. Penelope Thompson turned out to be a very sweet woman in her 60s who happily brought Nicole up to date. Please feel at home here. All I need from you is to keep the house clean and tidy. I don't mind having a child around, but please make sure she doesn't ruin the lawn and stays away from the pool, the woman asked. Thank you, ma'am. I'll do everything as you said. Trust me, you won't regret hiring me, Nicole replied with ardor. She liked the job right away. The house of Carl and Penelope Thompson was very cozy, and there was even a makeshift playground in the backyard. In addition to Nicole, there was a gardener and a driver working for the family. Nicole met the driver on her first day with the family, but she didn't come across the gardener until about a week or so later. As Mrs. Thompson warned her, Henry, the gardener, had lost his memory several years ago and was very unsociable. At first, Nicole didn't think of this information as anything important. It didn't seem to matter much whom the elderly couple chose to hire to work for them. But when she accidentally ran into Henry in the yard, her heart skipped a beat. The thing was, the gardener's face looked very familiar. Taking a closer look, she gasped, "David, is that you? What are you doing here?" In response, the gardener looked strangely at the maid and simply shook his head. "No, ma'am, you're mistaken. My name is Henry. We could have met before because I used to be homeless. I don't remember my past because I lost my memory when I got into a drunken fight," the man replied. "No, you're not homeless. Your name is David Wilson. Your parents are millionaires. Do you hear me? You got into a terrible car accident 5 years ago. I personally came to your grave," the maid exclaimed, getting agitated. The gardener looked at Nicole in surprise, but seeing the look in her eyes, he realized that the woman wasn't joking. "No, that's impossible. I lived in an abandoned trailer with other homeless people. And 6 months ago, Carl Thompson saw me and offered me a job. That's how I ended up here," the gardener said, grimacing from a headache. It was obvious from the man's face that he was painfully trying to remember his past. Unfortunately, his mind clearly needed some sort of a boost for his memory to come back. Meanwhile, Nicole carefully looked at Henry and realized that there could be no mistake. At that moment, the woman came up with the very interesting idea, which she decided to implement immediately. Having reached into the pocket of her uniform, she took out her phone and showed Henry the old selfies they used to take together. The gardener shrugged from surprise and sat down, grabbing his head with his hands. At that very moment, a flash pierced in the man's brain, which didn't only get him his memory back, but also brought the realization of what had actually happened to him 5 years ago. As it turned out, David did get into a fight with his parents on that fateful day, so he went out to meet his business partners. On his way, the young businessman picked up 2 hitchhikers, who turned out to be carjackers. After asking David to stop the car in a secluded place, they beat him up and threw his lifeless body into the river. Then, one of the criminals got behind the wheel of David's car and quickly left the crime scene. The carjacker had probably lost control of the car, because about a mile later, he got into an accident and burned down in David's sports car. All these thoughts and realizations rushed through David's head at the speed of light. Putting his broom aside, the man hugged Nicole and kissed her softly. Now that David remembered his past, he was no longer tormented by the thought that he was a homeless man who spent his life drinking and wandering the city streets. Of course, Nicole immediately forgave him for all of their arguments and introduced him to Sally. Looking at the gardener's unshaven face, the girl couldn't believe that he was her father. Seeing his daughter, David knelt down and began to kiss her hands with tears in his eyes. The man was crying, and he couldn't stop it. Carl and Penelope Thompson were amazed to learn the unfortunate story of the man's past. They just shook their heads and couldn't believe that it was all really happening. The fact was that they'd heard about the Wilson family, but they couldn't have ever suspected that they'd hired their son as a gardener. David, Nicole, and Sally left the home of Carl and Penelope Thompson that same day. The elderly couple understood their decision and sincerely wished them luck. Looking at the reunited family, they were 100% sure that David and Nicole had found their happiness. Because having been through so many hardships, the young people still managed to keep their love for each other, which had forever bound their hearts.